never thought I would graduate. If I gotta do a book report and then I gotta worry about not getting shot, like the book report is gonna be at the bottom of my priority list.
The skies of Los Angeles are black with smoke from the people went on a rampage.
I moved to Long Beach when I was 12, and life got really real, really fast. My father left, my brother went to jail, my mom was sick, my best friend died.
People were getting shot all the time, going to parties and not coming back.
I used violence defending myself and getting what I wanted. It didn't change as I got older, it just got worse.
We were jaded and pissed off, and we were just so done with education.
I walked into the teacher's lounge and heard that banter about those kids and them. And I realized that those kids and them were a code word for the kids that I had.
I didn't expect Erin to try to teach us anything. I knew that she was nothing more than a babysitter.
She was oblivious and nosy.
When it's obvious that a kid is not engaged, how can I make them want to learn?
Miss G announced that we were gonna journal.
The first 2 weeks, all I wrote was, I hate Erin Gruwell. If I wasn't on probation, I would probably shank her.
I could die today.
The whole day at school, I couldn't keep my mind off my new gun.
I live in a neighborhood where the sounds of gunshots are my lullaby. Nothing has been the same since my parents started smoking crack.
The first journal entries that I read was so difficult and yet so fascinating.
Take from others with no remorse.
Their writing was amazing.
The diary gave you a purpose.
It was a safe haven for me.
We needed people to pay attention to what we were doing. We needed to take our story to the nation's capital, to the Secretary of Education.
There are 150 freedom writers, and they tell their story in a book called The Freedom Writer's Diary.
I'll never forget, this man was very disgruntled and he said, "What are you doing?" And one of the freedom writers said, "We're changing the world."
It doesn't take 150, it only takes one.
When I think about the monument you are now erecting with names, our teachers, our professors, I think of my students. I think of Tony, a young boy who walked into my class, whose father was a coyote, who brought over undocumented workers to our country. I think of Henry, whose mother was lying on a couch dying, and his father was out in the streets drinking out of a brown paper bag. I think of Maria, who walked into my classroom with a black eye, an ankle monitor, and a probation officer. I think of student after student who walked into my class at the age of 14, and they hated reading, they hated writing. Based on where they were sitting, they hated each other. And the only thing that brought them together in perfect harmony was they really hated me, this annoying, perky cheerleader from hell. I was wearing polka dots, I was wearing pearls, and somehow, some way, I just wanted those stories about that sonnet written by Shakespeare or that Odyssey written by Homer to leap out of the pages of a book and give my students the answers, to give them a voice. But I looked out into this sea of students, a sea of students who had just faced one of the toughest riots in our country, the Los Angeles riots. And I was hoping that it would be like a phoenix rising from the ashes, that my students would realize that they no longer had to be against a wall, to reach for a fist or a spray can or a gun. Maybe the cliche about reaching for a pen and using it as mightier than the sword would work for these students. But I learned at the age of 14 in 9th grade, my students had never read that book. They never sat on their daddy's lap and read about green eggs and ham or identified Waldo. Because for most of my students, they didn't have that daddy in the home. For a lot of those students, that daddy was sitting on that doorstep. That daddy was behind bars. Or for a lot of my students, tragically, that daddy was 6 feet under. So I realized that my students didn't want to pick up that book or pick up that pen or listen to me. So I decided that I wanted to give my students a voice. And to do so, I decided to get a marble journal and a pen. And for the very first assignment, I told them I didn't care about spelling or grammar or punctuation. I just wanted them to write what needed to be written and to tell what needed to be told. That little girl in that corner, I wanted her to pick up that pen and maybe tell me about her mother, that mother that got up at the crack of dawn every single morning to go clean those big, beautiful homes she was never going to live in. About that mama who worked that second job every day scrubbing toilets in beautiful hotels just like this one that they were never going to stay in. I wanted her to tell me something. But as you just saw, she picked up her pen and she wrote, I hate Erin Gruwell. I hate Erin Gruwell. And if I wasn't on probation, I would probably shank her. Exclamation point. So at least she got the punctuation right. But I grew up in suburbia and I had no idea what shanking was. I now know, going to Urban Dictionary, it's not good. So I realized if I need my students to use their voice, I need to give them an opportunity to do so. So I had to be subversive and sneaky. And I came up with a game that was anything but a game. I wanted my students to come out of the darkness, come out of that feeling of being invisible, of being ignored. So I put this piece of tape down the center of my classroom and I was just going to ask them questions. And I realized I was competing against pop culture. The hour upon hour that they played video games that were live in 3D with images jumping off a screen. Or the hours that they wasted away watching reality TV. Or when they snuck into those darkened movie theaters and escaped reality as Marvel characters leapt off a screen. So the first few questions I asked were very simple. Stay on the line if you have this song. Or you like this icon. Or you've seen this movie. They rolled their eyes, they did fist bumps, they came to that line and they thought, this woman is crazy. What does this question about Snoop or the song have to do with me? Or school or academia? But my hope was if I asked enough questions, they would come. It would be this gravitational pull. And then the questions would get serious. Stay on the line if you're poor. And each and every one of my students, no matter their size, their hue, the side of the street they came from, they stood on that line. And even though they were looking at their mortal enemy, each and every one of those kids realized we are much more similar than we are different. Each and every one of those kids knew what it felt like in the pit of their stomach to be hungry, to want, to wish, to dare to dream. And the questions continued. Stay on the line if you've ever been homeless. And I'll never forget this young girl came to the line first and stood there. She'd come to that line about this song or about this movie, and she even came to that line with a question about poverty. But when I asked a question that was so specific, it was like a neon light was on here. And she stood in that line, and for a second, that must have felt like an hour, her entire demeanor changed, and I saw her almost implode in front of my very eyes. Because those seconds must have felt like hours. And she looked at the floor. I think she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. I think she wanted to disappear. I think she wanted me to hurry and ask another question. She wanted to be invisible. She just wanted to go back to that wall. And as she looked at her feet thinking, I don't want to see them because I don't want them to see me. Because if they see me, they're going to see my story. They're going to see that I'm that girl that doesn't know where I'm going to sleep tonight. They're going to know that I'm that girl that doesn't know what I'm going to eat tonight. They're going to know that I'm that girl that sits in class every day, wondering where my next meal is coming from, knowing that no one's going to share their lunch, ask me to a game, ask me to a prom. And that second that must have felt like hours as that movie in her mind played again and again, suddenly another girl joined her. A girl that had that same movie in her mind, similar and yet different. And unlike that girl looking at her feet and wanting to disappear, this young woman stood in that line with her chest puffed out. And she looked at each and every one of us in the eye like a sucker punch. She wanted us to see her. She wanted us to see her because seeing her meant we saw her story. And in fact, we had. We'd seen her story every single day. At 4 o'clock, like clockwork, she stood on that corner, Pacific Coast Highway, the busiest street in our city. And she stood in that corner with a cardboard box. She'd taken a marker from her art class and written in big, bold letters, "We'll work for food." And she stood there. She stood there hoping that humanity would see her, hoping that someone would walk by her and throw coins in a cup, hoping at the end of the day that someone would bring her a half-eaten burger. And maybe, just maybe, when she didn't have coins or that cup, she'd give it to her daddy. And maybe tonight was going to be the night that they'd have that flea bag motel. Maybe tonight's the night I can take a shower. Maybe tonight I can sleep in a bed. Maybe tonight I don't have to be so scared. Hour after hour, day after day, she would collect those coins. She'd give it to her daddy, and he'd smoke it in a crack pipe. And so she was out on that cold concrete every day. And yet, in that glorious minute, as she stood in that line, she wanted us to see her because she wanted us to know, this may be my story now, but this story doesn't define me. This story's going to change. And suddenly out came this beautiful boy. He too was homeless. He too had that same story. He always asked for that top video game, those designer jeans. He should have asked for something less expensive, something that hardworking mom could afford. And all he wanted to do was to fit in, to play hoop with the boys. And yet at the age of 14, to be hopeless, he stood on that line next to two perfect strangers, and they changed the game. And those three individuals allowed me to realize I may have walked into this classroom as a teacher, but I am their student because I now know what courage means. I now know what resilience means. I may not see those scratches and those cuts and those bruises, but I got to get these kids to a place where they can heal, where they can feel whole, where they can feel that they can pick up that pen and write what needs to be written, where they can stand up and be heard and tell what needs to be told. So the questions continued, and my kids kept coming. They stood in line when they were asked a question about alcoholism because they knew all too well who was drinking, who had that brown paper bag, who had just lost their job, who'd come on hard times, what it was like to walk on those eggshells, not to wake up that sleeping giant, because if they did, fisticuffs, someone was going down, and that someone was usually them. They stood in that line about questions about depression, that dark cloud, about standing on a ledge, looking at a medicine cabinet, putting a razor blade to their wrist, cutting just so they could feel, because they were tired of being numb. They were tired of being anesthetized. They stood in a line when I asked questions about drugs. They knew who was selling and slanging, who was tweaking, who was losing their teeth, who was losing their minds. They knew. I asked a question, stay in line if you've ever been abused. And I didn't realize the magnitude of that. Teachers are mandated reporters. Teachers are supposed to make things better. And the most beautiful boy I have ever seen stood in that line, and he hated me. I could feel the daggers in his eye and the smoke coming out of his ears. And it wasn't just me he hated every teacher, every person with power, anyone with authority. Because at the tender age of 14, he thought we were all rats, we were all snitches. Because his story had started years before when his leader, his teacher, his mama would take out every single moment on him. And he got those cuts and he got those bruises, but he took them like a man. And he learned this game. He learned this game that he could put on a long sleeve shirt, put on a turtleneck, go to school and tell that teacher he got knocked around on the field. When he got popped in the eye, he would just say that happened on the football field or going for a free throw. And he was so busy playing that game and protecting that mama that in his mind, in his nobility, thought, at least if I take those licks like a man, I can protect my 7 brothers and sisters so they won't have to. He made it all the way to middle school, all the way to 7th grade, 12 years old, taking those cuts, taking those licks. And then one day he came home from school and saw a cop car sitting outside of his home. And he realized, I'm so busy taking those licks and playing that game. I never taught my little sister how to play that game. So my little sister must have gone to school. And some teacher must have seen those cuts and must have seen those bruises. And that teacher must have called Child Protective Services, and Child Protective Services must have called the cops. And now we're all being taken away. And at the age of 12, he had this sinking feeling that he was never going to protect those little brothers and sisters again. And at the age of 14, standing on a line in my classroom, he was right. Because at the age of 14, he was still taking those licks. Not from a mama, but from a stranger. Because at the age of 14, he had already been to 42 foster homes. 42. I I didn't see those cuts. I didn't see those bruises. But I wanted this young boy to realize you have a voice. And when you cry, those screams are not going to fall on deaf ears ever again. We're going to right a wrong. We're going to leave a legacy. We're going to start a movement. So I went out on the search to find stories. Stories written by and for and about courageous kids. A little girl in an attic. A little girl in an attic who would look out her window and watch her friends being led off like sheep to slaughter. And yet that little girl in an attic picked up a pen and she chronicled her story. A story about hope. In spite of everything, she said, I still believe that people are really good at heart. A little girl by the name of Anne Frank. A young boy named Elie Wiesel who was crammed into a cattle car. Rode into Auschwitz-Birkenau, watched his entire family perish in a chimney. And he picked up a pen and got a Nobel Peace Prize in the process. A little girl on the streets of Bosnia-Herzegovina who watched her friends being picked up by snipers on her way to school. I gave these books to my kids with the idea, tell your own story. Learn from them. Some of these people didn't make it, but I want you to make it. And originally it was very scary for my students to pick up a book. So in order to do so, I decided that we were going to have a toast for change. At the age of 14, I wanted to wipe the slate clean. I wanted to start over. I wanted my students to realize that maybe it doesn't matter that you've been kicked out of every school you've ever attended. Maybe it doesn't matter that you have a 0.5 GPA and failed every class. Starting today, starting right now, pick up a plastic champagne glass and toast to change. And when my students did that, they weren't toasting about a number 2 pencil. They weren't toasting about picking up that ballpoint pen and writing that perfect 5-paragraph essay. They weren't talking about just picking up a book and reading it from cover to cover. They wanted a sweeping change. Maria stood up and she said, I don't want to be pregnant by the time I turn 15 like my mama. I don't want to spend the rest of my life behind bars like my daddy. And I don't want to be 6 feet under by the time I turn 18 like my cousin. I want to change. And student after student stood up. They were tired of being poor. They were tired of being picked on. They were tired of eating that government cheese. They were tired of sitting on a bed waiting for that deadbeat dad to come home and bring them a present. Tell them they loved them, to be there. And as each and every one of my students picked up that plastic champagne glass and talked about change, I realized we'd started something. I didn't know where it would go. I didn't know what it would mean. But I wanted each and every one of those students who were told, you're not going to make it, to rewrite that ending. Even though they couldn't change the cast of characters they were dealt. They were told they were dumb. They were told they were stupid. They were told they were nothing. I wanted them to change that paradigm, to go anywhere, to do anything. And they did. And at that moment, I watched 150 kids come together as one. And they read those books. And they graduated, each and every one of them. And then they became lifelong learners. They got on a plane and they flew across the globe. And they walked up these stairs leading into Anne Frank's attic on the day that she'd been captured, August 4th. And then they joined hands and they walked across railroad tracks leading to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And they walked through the streets of Bosnia-Herzegovina during the middle of a war. And then they came back to this country and they wrote their story, hoping that some kid somewhere would say, that's my story. I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of being alone. And each and every day that passed, I was less of a teacher and I was more of a student. I was humbled to my core. I was humbled when my kids used big words like they were civil rights activists, that they were going to take a name like the freedom riders from the 60s, who fought for equality, who fought for something bigger, who fought for the right to sit on that bus, to drink out of that drinking fountain, to go to that lunch counter, to stand up for something that is bigger than themselves. My kids wanted to be heard, and in doing so, they wanted every other kid to do so. I stand in front of you today as an ordinary teacher who had extraordinary experience. And my students weren't ready to stop when their pencil was down and the bell had rung and the graduation diploma had been given. They weren't ready to cut that umbilical cord. So for 20 years, every single day, I see those faces. They were the first in their family to go to college. And they came back like a homing pigeon, and they said, we want to start something bigger. They're now my bosses. Every single day, these freedom writers come to work. I sit beside them in this inclusive, egalitarian place. They write letters. They visit kids. They give hope. They believe in change. Every single day, I walk in and I sometimes feel like their leader, and other times I'm a follower. But I feel like I'm following something that is bigger than myself, almost that North Star, that beacon. Because I know now that change is possible, that at any time, at any moment, anyone can become something bigger. My students had the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C., to stand in front of our nation's leaders. They looked around, they said, oh my God, there's so many old white men in this room. And there are. But in that moment, my students were larger than life, one of which said that she was going to be the first Latina Secretary of Education. And she snapped. I know there was a lot of Secret Service here today with Bill Clinton, and if those same Secret Service were there at that time, they would have thrown my girl out of the joint. But they didn't. They stood on their feet. They gave her a standing ovation, and they are waiting. They are waiting for her to go to Pennsylvania Avenue and take over the joint. So ordinary people can be leaders, but ordinary people have to try to do extraordinary things. Each and every one of you have the opportunity to have a Maria, a Tony, a Darius walk into your room, walk into your business, and someday allow you to follow them. So I hope each and every one of you go back to your business, look at those faces, listen to those stories, and hope that someday they too can live the dream. Thank you.